Okay. So, have you ever like gotten into like a debate with someone, friend or whatever, about whether like a rule is actually a law? You know,
Mm.
like is it just something silly someone made up, or like does it actually have like real weight behind it?
Right, right.
Well, guess what? Philosophers have been arguing about this like for centuries.
Oh, yeah.
And today we're going to dive into some pretty deep legal theory from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to unpack the concept of, you ready for this? The nature of law.
Yeah, it might sound a little dry at first, but trust me, this stuff gets surprisingly interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And it's way more relevant to your life than you might think. Like, we're not going to be going line by line through, legal code or anything.
Right.
But instead, we're going to try to figure out the fundamental, like, DNA of any legal system. Like,
Okay.
what makes a law,
Yeah. Think of it like this. We all know the difference between like a democracy and a monarchy, right? Well, these philosophers are trying to understand the core operating principles that make any system of laws actually work.
So it's like comparing, Windows to Mac OS. Like, they both run computers, but they do it in totally different ways.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. And within this, there are two big questions they're really wrestling with.
Okay.
The first one is, what are the conditions of legal validity?
Hmm.
Meaning, what actually makes something a law, beyond just like someone with power saying so.
Right, because I said so doesn't usually fly in a court of law, right?
Exactly.
So what's the second big question then?
The second one is the question of the normativity of law.
Okay.
So in plain English, why should we even care what the law says?
Right.
Where does its power to like actually make us do things
Oh.
come from?
Okay, I'm already feeling like my brain is doing push-ups.
Yeah.
So let's start unpacking some of these ideas.
Mhm.
You mentioned two main schools of thought, natural law and legal positivism.
Right.
What's the quick and dirty on those two? Yeah.
Well, natural law is like the OG legal theory. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome.
Wow.
And the basic idea is that an unjust law isn't really a law at all.
Okay.
So think of it like morality trumps legality.
So if a law goes against some higher sense of what's right, it's basically null and void. Is that how it works?
Well, it gets a bit complicated.
Right.
On the other side, you've got legal positivism,
Okay.
and they're all about saying, hey, the law is whatever the system says it is full stop, even if it's morally iffy.
Wait, so you're saying they think a law can be totally messed up, ethically speaking, but still be a law you have to follow?
Right.
How does that even work?
Well, it's all about separating what is from what ought to be.
Okay.
Legal positivists argue that a law's validity comes from social facts, basically how it was created within the system.
Hmm.
Think of a badly written instruction manual for like your new gadget or something.
Oh.
It might be terrible, but you still technically have to follow it if it's the official one, right?
Okay, yeah, I kind of see where they're coming from. But doesn't that create some problems? Like, what if the system itself is messed up, like in a dictatorship or something?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's where the social thesis comes in.
Okay.
So legal positivists say that law is ultimately a human creation, a social construct.
Okay.
Its power comes from things we collectively do and believe.
Right.
So if a society values fairness and justice, those values will ideally be reflected in its laws.
So even though they're focusing on the process of how laws are made, they're not totally ignoring the moral side of things.
Exactly. And it gets even more nuanced with something called inclusive legal positivism.
Oh, wow.
Some positivists say morality can directly factor into whether a law is valid,
Okay.
but only if that's how the system is set up.
Right.
So imagine a country where a law is only officially on the books if a majority of citizens also vote that it's ethically sound.
Oh, that's a fascinating twist.
Right.
So let's test this out with a real-world example. Imagine a law that says, no wearing purple hats. Total ridiculous.
Yeah, a classic example.
Yep.
So a legal positivist would ask, was this no purple hats rule passed through the normal lawmaking process?
Right.
Did the legislature vote on it? Did the executive sign it? All that jazz.
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then boom, it's a valid law, even if everyone thinks it's dumb.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So for them, it's all about following the procedures, even if the outcome is nonsensical.
Yeah.
But where does this leave the natural law folks? They must have something to say about this.
Oh, they definitely do. They'd say this no purple hats law. It might be on the books, but it doesn't have the moral authority of a real law.
Okay, so it's like a zombie law.
Yeah.
It's walking and talking, but it's not really alive.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. But here's where things get tricky for the natural law folks.
Okay.
How do they deal with the fact that historically there have been tons of unjust laws.
Right.
I mean, slavery, segregation, denying women the right to vote, all of that was legal at some point.
Yeah.
So are they saying those weren't really laws?
Yeah. That's a tough one. If they're saying those things weren't laws, it seems like they're not really living in the real world.
Right. That's a common criticism. But modern natural law philosophers have come up with some pretty clever ways to respond to that.
Okay.
One of them, John Finnis, he argues that bad laws do exist,
Okay.
but they're like corrupted versions of the ideal law.
Yeah.
You know, think about a carpenter's tool that's been damaged or something.
Hook.
It still is a hammer, but it's not going to do its job very well.
Right.
It's kind of the same idea.
So they're saying these unjust laws, they're like broken tools.
Exactly.
They exist, but they're not fulfilling the true purpose of a law.
Exactly. Finnis says that true law is all about promoting the common good, fostering human flourishing. You know, things like that.
Right.
And these bad laws are like those broken tools. They might have the outward form of law, but they're not actually serving at that higher purpose.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this plays out in like the real world. Think about a time you followed a rule, even though you thought it was totally pointless. You know,
Yeah.
like maybe at work or something, there's some silly procedure that everyone has to go through, but no one knows why.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Right. And you're like, why are we even doing this?
Exactly.
But did you still consider it a rule? Did it have like some kind of power over you, even though you thought it was stupid?
Oh,
Like, this is kind of what natural law is grappling with.
yeah, that's a great way to connect it to people's own experience.
Right.
Now, to mix things up a little bit, let's bring in another big name in this whole debate. Ronald Dworkin.
Okay.
He's not strictly a natural law guy,
Right.
but he poses a real challenge to legal positivism.
Ooh, this is where things get spicy. Tell me more.
Well, Dworkin basically says you can't separate what law is from what it should be.
Okay.
And his reason for that is that figuring out what the law means in any given situation always involves interpretation. And interpretation, Dworkin says, always has a moral dimension.
So you're saying that even just figuring out what a law means requires us to make moral judgments.
Exactly.
That seems like a pretty radical idea.
It is. It challenges that whole positivist idea of keeping law and morality in separate boxes.
Right.
Here's a classic example. Imagine a law that says no vehicles in the park.
Okay.
Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, until you start thinking about it.
Exactly what counts as a vehicle.
Right. Does that include bike scooters, those little kids' cars that you push with your feet?
Exactly. Dworkin would say, to really figure this out, you have to consider the purpose of the law.
Okay.
What was it trying to achieve? Was
Okay.
it about safety? Was it about preserving the peace and quiet of the park?
Right.
And those purposes are often tied to moral ideas, you know, like fairness, consideration for others, things like that.
So he's saying even just applying a simple law like no vehicles requires us to think about moral values.
Exactly. And if he's right, that whole positivist project of separating law and morality starts to break down.
This is blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Okay, so we've talked about what makes a law valid in the first place.
Right.
But what about why we should even care what the law says? Is it just about avoiding punishment?
Well, that's a question that's really puzzled legal theorists for a long time.
I bet.
And early positivists had a pretty simple answer.
Yep.
They basically said law is just the sovereign, you know, the king, the government, whoever's in charge
Right.
saying do this or else.
So it's all about the threat of force, like follow the rules or we'll throw you in jail.
Pretty much. But another very famous legal philosopher, H.L.A. Hart, he thought this was way too simplistic.
Okay.
He said law does more than just threaten us. It actually gives us reasons to act in certain ways.
Okay. I'm intrigued. How does that work?
Well, think about it. Often following the law just makes sense, even if there's no cop watching over your shoulder.
Right.
Take traffic laws, for example.
Yeah.
We stop at red lights, not just because we're afraid of getting a ticket,
Right.
but because it keeps things running smoothly and it prevents accidents.
Yeah, that's true. It's about maintaining order and safety, not just avoiding punishment.
Exactly. So Hart argued that law has a kind of internal logic to it. It
Mhm.
creates a system of rules that we can all rely on and that often just makes our lives easier and safer.
So it's like a giant cooperative game we're all playing.
Yeah.
We agree to follow the rules because it benefits everyone in the long run.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then another important thinker, Joseph Raz, takes this idea even further with his concept of legitimate authority.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's this about authority?
So Raz argues that law is all about figuring out what to do when we're faced with lots of different reasons, kind of pulling us in different directions.
Life.
Exactly. It's like having a trusted expert to kind of guide us through a complicated maze.
Okay, so it's not just about blind obedience, but about trusting that the law is giving us good reasons to act in certain ways.
Exactly. But here's the catch. For authority to be legitimate, it has to meet certain conditions. And Raz says there are two big ones. Well, the first one is that we need to be able to recognize an instruction as authoritative without having to go back and rethink, all the original reasons for the rule.
So it's like we trust that the lawmakers have already done their homework.
Right.
They made a decision that was based on solid reasoning, and we don't have to like reinvent the wheel every time we encounter a law.
Exactly. And the second condition is that the authority has to have some kind of independent basis for its judgments. It can't just be parroting back what everyone already believes.
So it's not like a popularity contest. The law has to have some kind of real expertise or insight that goes beyond just what the majority thinks.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting for Dworkin and his idea about morality being kind of baked into legal interpretation. Remember, he says you can't separate what law is from what it should be.
Yeah, and you're saying that Raz's view on authority kind of throws a wrench in that. How so?
Well, if Raz is right and legitimate authority has to be based on independent judgments, then it can't just be a matter of everyone interpreting the law based on their own, personal moral compass.
Right.
That would make the law way too subjective and unpredictable.
Yeah, like whose morals are we using?
Exactly.
Right.
So Dworkin might have to tweak his theory a little bit to account for this idea of legitimate authority.
Yeah. Or maybe they could both be right in some ways.
That's a great point. It highlights just how complex these issues really are.
Yeah.
We've got all these different theories about what makes law valid in the first place, why we should follow it, how morality fits into the picture or doesn't.
Yeah.
It's enough to make your head spin.
It really is. I feel like I need to go lie down after this. But I'm starting to see how these different ideas, like, they play off of each other.
Yeah.
And how they connect to real-world situations.
Right.
So where does all this leave us? Like, what's the big takeaway for someone who's just, dipping their toes into the philosophy of law?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that the question of what is law is way more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, for sure.
There are these deep philosophical debates about its very nature, its relationship to morality, the source of its authority.
It's not just like you open up a law book and read the rules.
Yeah.
There's a whole universe of ideas behind those rules.
Exactly. And I think the second takeaway is that these debates, they actually matter.
Yeah, they do.
They shape how we think about everything from simple laws like, no vehicles in the park.
Right.
To like big complex issues like human rights, social justice, the limits of government power.
So the next time I see a law, I disagree with it. I should ask myself, is this just a bad law?
Right.
Or does it actually fail to be a law at all because it's unjust?
Yeah.
And how do my own moral views maybe influence how I interpret and interact with the law?
Yeah, those are all great questions to be asking.
Well, this deep dive has just scratched the surface of this topic. But if anyone's interested in exploring further, I highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the nature of law.
It's a great resource for anyone who really wants to dive deep into this stuff.
It sounds like a rabbit hole worth going down.
For sure.
Well, thanks for taking us on this deep dive into the philosophy of law. It's been really mind-expanding.
My pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about this stuff.
And to our listeners, keep questioning, keep exploring, and as always, happy deep diving.